what we thought we'd do is just give you a little bit of a sampling of what our book is about and an approach that we took to our topic. Its the full title is Apocalypse Jukebox, The End of the World in American Popular Music. And Warren was actually just playing a mix, which is actually the jukebox that we were writing about. And when we started this project, which was about 5 years ago, we made several decisions. Some of the most important ones include the fact that we didn't even attempt to be encyclopedic or complete in any way with this topic because, as you know, we're music fans from way back. I think it's really, you know, as far as art goes, it's our first love. We both teach English as well, but we actually got into that through music, ironically. So it was a sort of natural sort of thing for us to do. But in looking at a lot of books on music, we decided early on that we didn't want to try to be completists about our idea. So what we tried to do was to pick a small representative sample of artists that we thought represented a particular facet of our concept. And just to wildly oversimplify it, the basic idea, the thesis of the book really is that you know, America is basically founded on apocalyptic principles going back to Columbus. And that particular word these days tends to strike fear notes more than anything. But what we tried to do also is to show the varied and complex sense of that term, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And there is a lot of good to it as well. But the way that we approached that with music was to look at how this, what I would argue, the most popular art form is permeated with these cultural concepts in various kinds of ways. And so what we're going to try to do is we're going to read short samples from the book to give you a sense of the flavor of it. And we'd be happy to talk later on about, in more detail, about the way that we go about our idea. But I wanted to read you a few pages from the very introduction, which focuses on, in the 1960s, some aspects of rock and roll as what we all know to be the devil's music, and the way that that permeates the bad and the ugly of the apocalyptic concept. So I'm just going to jump into it. Beginning with an author named Bob Larson, who's probably not on the tip of anybody's tongue these days, but he wrote a book in the 60s, actually 4 years before The Summer of Love, called Rock and Roll, the Devil's Diversion. And in this book, Larson, a self-proclaimed former rocker turned minister, was even more emphatic about the apocalyptic consequences of using rock and roll. He wrote, "Satan is aware that this generation is most likely the one that will see the return of Christ, and he's therefore created a master plan to dominate and control today's youth. Rock and roll is part of this plan to achieve a worldwide moral decay." Like Garlock, another writer who does basically the same thing, Frank Garlock, Larson claims that Satan is able to enslave listeners by using their ecstatic responses against them. Larson includes an array of expert evidence in order to further establish the demonic connection. He writes, he quotes a man named Dr. Sable, Bernard Sable, a child guidance expert of the Washington State Division of Community Service, who witnessed normally recognizable girls at a rock and roll concert as if possessed by some demonic urge, defying in emotional ecstasy the restraint which authorities try to place on them. There are several levels of suppression and repression going on here, not least of which is the suggestion that girls can defy restraint by having orgasms. Of course, from Larson's point of view, those restraints are perhaps the only thing standing in the way of Satan's attempt to recruit fresh minions for the final battle. Larson ends where he began with Apocalypse. He writes, "Rock and roll music is part of man's attempt to drive from his mind the consequences of his evil living. The devil is seeking to divert man's attention from the nearness of the second coming of Jesus Christ." And it's tempting to lambaste these men for their efforts to demonize a musical form that, like jazz and blues before it, has become something of an American cultural institution. The anxieties they express seem almost as far removed as 19th century worries about the dangers and follies of early 19th century Methodist congregations. Yet there is one overarching aspect to both arguments that's tenable. rock and roll can evoke an almost religious ecstasy and enthusiasm. Garlock and Larson earnestly want to draw a line in the sand. Such an effort seems doomed to failure, though it is not hard to see what motivates that attempt. Rock and roll audiences often appear inspired by an ecstatic sense of devotion and worship. Whether they really are or not, there's the rub. But it's understandable how some might consider such response profane, blasphemous even. Plus, it is a fact that such enthusiasm can go terribly wrong. Garlock is right to point out that Charles Manson used rock not only to establish his own perverted sort of religion, but also to enact his own apocalyptic interpretations. And from there we go on to talk about Charles Manson and David Koresh as some contemporary holy rollers. Anyway, that's a sense of how the book begins. I'm going to turn it over to Ed now, and he'll talk about where we go from there.
All right. Well, thank you. We work from those beginnings with Manson and Koresh, and again, it's not a coincidence that before either one became an apocalyptic prophet, they were both failed guitarists. They were both failed musicians. But we work through the paranoia that really shadows the development of rock and roll. I mean, rock and roll music, was born under the shadow of a mushroom cloud, the atomic bomb. And so we walk through that, and then we as David mentioned, focus on a number of different performers, including Bob Dylan, Leonard Cohen, Devo, who too many people think are just one-hit wonders and a novelty act, and nobody gets the joke of de-evolution and the idea that we are already post-apocalyptic in the Devo mantra. But I wanted to read a section tonight from, since conveniently they just released their follow-up album after 5 years of waiting to American Idiot. Green Day just released their new album, 21st Century Breakdown. And so I wanted to read a segment from the final chapter of the book, which is devoted to Green Day and their American Idiot album as an adolescent apocalypse. Because, as has been noted numerously, none the least of which by Don DeLillo, pointed out that American rock and roll is apocalyptic because adolescence, by its very nature, in being so self-aware, is an apocalyptic time. So I focus on Green Day's American Idiot as an adolescent apocalyptic album. The chapter opens with focusing on Nirvana, actually, because Nirvana was supposed to be the rebirth of rock and roll after a period where that genre had not been selling very well. And, of course, the tragedy of Kurt Cobain's suicide only 4 years after Nirvana's breakthrough touched so many people so deeply, and I'm sure Josh will have some things to say about that with his book. But in the shadow of Cobain's suicide, a bunch of teenage malcontents by the name of Green Day scored a 10 million selling album by the name of Dookie. And at the time, a lot of music critics and music fans felt some resistance and even anger that the promise of Nirvana had been not met. And then here are these kids jerking around, completely unserious, and is this what the future of music is supposed to be? Of course, Green Day has gone on to prove themselves worthy of all the attention that they've garnered. But let me just jump right into the chapter here. Dookie was huge, selling 10 million copies and receiving credit for finally bringing punk rock to the American masses. But it was a mixed blessing. In the shadow of Cobain's suicide, the album's goofiness seemed to many critics and serious rock fans an unfortunate shift away from meaningful music with a message. The revolutionary promise Nirvana had offered in 1991 had in just 3 years turned to, well, dookie, i.e. shit. The album's lead single, after all, was about getting stoned and jerking off. How could anyone take that seriously, even if it did possess a kick-ass bass lead-in finer than any since Aerosmith's Sweet Emotion? Green Day's success was seen by many as unjustified in the light of the commercial indifference suffered by so many of the bands that had so obviously influenced them. But such a brush-off was unfair. Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit, with Cobain's anthemic cry of "Here we are now, entertain us," is not all that different from Green Day's masturbatory anthem Longview, where Armstrong searches in vain for some form of meaningful entertainment. I sit around and watch the tube, but nothing's on. I change the channels for an hour or two, twiddle my thumbs just for a bit. I'm sick of all the same old shit. When Cobain calls out, "I feel stupid and contagious," the expression can be taken both as an ironic statement of self-worth and as a choice, as in, I want something stupid and contagious. I am the American pop audience, after all. Cobain's angry chorus is an impatient shout, a demand for dumb entertainment. And that's just what the malcontents of Green Day deliver in glorious abandon on their own debut hit single. Sure, Cobain was being tongue-in-cheek, but so too is the self-congratulatory dumbness of Longview. Both songs embrace the alleged stupidity of youth culture as a means of taking the mass culture to task for pandering to youth and being clueless as to what they're really interested in. "You sell us nothing but crap," they both say, and then call us idiots for buying it. Both songs at their core criticize the adult marketers of mass consumerism while demanding something else. That something else is their own voice, their own identity. Both songs infer that without that, what's going on? What's the point of going on? Armstrong puts it succinctly, "I got no motivation. Where is my motivation?" In no small way, the critical slagging Green Day suffered for being young and unwilling to conform to the expectations of others is no different than that suffered by any young person or group of young people who have the audacity to try and forge their own path and do their own thing. It's reflective of the general anxiety that adolescence breeds in the adult population. America has traditionally taken a panicked attitude towards its young, predicting that each succeeding generation will be the one to squander the promise of democracy and bring about an end to our nation's world dominance. The 20th century offers a succession of doom and gloom predictions from those who have forgotten their own past indiscretions regarding America's youth, from flappers in short skirts, skirting prohibition laws, to young jazzers discovering marijuana, to blue jean and leather-jacketed juvenile delinquents dragging Maine on a Saturday night, to hippie kids tuning in, turning on, and dropping out. The punks and slackers and goths of the past 30 years are just the latest youth subcultures to vex their parents' and their grandparents' generations into paranoid apoplexy. Like Shakespeare's Prince Hal, every American generation of teenagers seems to hang out with the wrong crowd, flaunt law and order, and make stupid decisions on their way to stepping comfortably into their parents' shoes and going about the business of fulfilling their places within the dominant hierarchy. Those flapper kids became the greatest generation, after all. And it didn't take long for those hippie kids to embrace the groovy aura of unchecked capitalism in the 1980s. Aside from those moments leading up to the big question mark that waits on the other side, no period of the human life cycle is as fraught with apocalyptic anxiety as adolescence. As a transition from childhood to adulthood, adolescence is often framed in apocalyptic terms. Adding to the anxiety surrounding adolescence is the worry, which every adult generation seems to succumb to, that the current crop of adolescents have lost their moral center and are hell-bent on destroying the heaven on earth that their parents have made for them. I'm a parent. I'm watching my children destroy everything as we speak. But jumping forward to American Idiot itself, let me just read the intro to that part of the chapter, and then we'll turn things over to Josh, and then maybe open things up for questions and answers, because there's so much stuff going on in these things. It's hard to cover everything. And right. America's young, trapped in an expanded adolescence, are the subject and audience of American Idiot, an album saturated in apocalyptic imagery and language to match its time and subject matter. Leading up to that statement, I examined theories of adolescence, which, by the way, adolescence is a 20th century invention of social psychologists, and also note the differences over the space of 150 years of exactly what constitutes an adolescent. You go back 100 years ago, and a 16-year-old was an adult. If they had finished high school or finished whatever schooling was deemed necessary, they were able to enter into the workforce, marry, start raising a family, etc. With the economic realities of contemporary America, most folks have to put off marriage and long-term employment until after college, which goes to 22, 23, 24, and let's not even talk about the debt brought on by student loans, etc. So we're expanding adolescence, that period of where you have to wait until you're an adult. Unless you do something wrong, then we'll charge your ass as an adult. So it's quite a contradictory, as Matthew Arnold wrote in his poem Dover Beach, which most American high schoolers have been assigned in English class, not that any of them have actually read it, wandering between two worlds, one dead, the other powerless to be born. Such is the state of the American adolescent. And such forms the grounding of Green Day's American Idiot. The urban landscape populated by the denizens of American Idiot, the James Dean-like Jesus of suburbia, the drug dealer prophet, St. Jimmy, and the whore of Babylon figure, what's-her-name, is awash in apocalyptic signs and symbols. These characters are locked in an apocalyptic moment, aware, as Billy Joe Armstrong sings in Holiday, that this is the dawning of the rest of our lives. But this is no new heaven on earth they are being born into. L.A. is the city of the damned, its shopping mall bathroom walls covered with profane but holy scriptures. The rain here falls like an Armageddon flame, and the dogs howl hymns called faith and misery. Even a teenage kiss elicits crisis in the heart's apocalypse. These kids learn their catechisms in the 7-Eleven parking lot. All the necessary elements of a healthy youth, optimism, family, opportunity, love, security, home, are corrupted here. This is not Charles Kuralt's America. It's Charlie Manson's. In this apocalypse of St. Billy Joe, Jesus has returned to earth not in glory to judge the living and the dead, but rather in anonymity, to be judged by the living dead that populate the new American landscape, the American idiots for whom life is conformity to a narrow, moral, and materialistic agenda, and for whom thinking is a dangerous drug to which one should just say no. Only the officially sanctioned drugs of sugar, Ritalin, nicotine, alcohol, and the mass media are welcome. The struggle at the heart of American Idiot, and by symbolic extension, the struggle of adolescence itself, is the struggle not to give in to the mass conformity that is the center of American society, that, quote, center of the earth that is the end of the world. The struggle is to create a new world from within the tremors of a dying world, to become a true self, free from the stain of the sin of conformity and corrupt materialism. Armstrong's Jesus of suburbia must face down the temptation of sin in the spiritual desert that is the early 21st century American landscape. This is not the Jesus of Nikos Kazantzakis' Last Temptation of Christ. The Satan that Armstrong's Jesus faces is not an animate demon. This devil is truly in the details. And with this, let me turn things over to Josh.
Well, I'll start off with that if anyone's even partially interested in what Edward and David read from, I would definitely recommend to pick it up if you've already bought the 27s. But their book is fantastic. I'm two-thirds of the way through it, and it's a fascinating book, so definitely check it out. I'm only one half of the 27s team. My partner, Eric Siegelstadt, lives in Vermont, and he could not be here. So if I don't say anything accurately or mess up, it's his fault because he's not here. But I'm going to handle this the same way. I'm going to try and read some different nuggets from the book. Our project began really just kind of noticing that there was this pop culture phenomenon in rock history and music history of so many musicians, very influential musicians that died at the age of 27. But there was just really nothing done about it. And so we decided that we would tackle this. We would just write a short little bio, just kind of the expectation. We were going to write a chapter about each person, and I would do an illustration. Eric is the writer. But so much more came out of this, and all these different layers unfurled, like numerology and mythology and philosophy. And so we really kind of tackled all of that. And again, although we did prove after 3 years, and there actually was a study at the University of Liverpool about 2 years ago that more musicians have died at the age of 27 than any other age. We aren't really trying to say exactly with conclusion what the reason for this is, but there's a lot of coincidences, a lot of fascinating facts that you can definitely draw a lot of conclusions from. So I'm going to start off by just briefly covering the most recent event that really sparked the 27s, and that is the suicide of Kurt Cobain in Seattle in '94. He'd come to install an alarm system. The irony is that long before electrician Gary Smith found Kurt Cobain's body, it was clear that what Nirvana's singer really needed protection from was himself. Cobain wasn't identified for hours, but his mother, Wendy O'Connor, didn't need anyone to tell her that it was her son who was found with a shotgun and a suicide note that reportedly ended, "I love you, I love you." The singer had been missing, and his mother had feared that the most troubled and talented rock star of his generation would go the way of Jim Morrison and Jimi Hendrix. "Now he's gone and joined that stupid club," she told the Associated Press. "I told him not to join that stupid club." That's Jeff Giles from Newsweek, April 18th of '94. In our book, as I said, we tried to tackle these famous musicians, and most people are aware of the top 5, but there's actually 34. And although they're not as famous as, say, Hendrix or Joplin, when you dig in, you realize that their stories are just as fascinating. And definitely their influence, you just can't ignore. It's incredible. So I'm going to read a nugget from the artist Jesse Belvin, who's probably most well known for singing the song Earth Angel. Jesse toured the South in early 1960. He performed for non-segregated audience at a few gigs and received several death threats as a result. His mom, who was used to hearing from him every couple of weeks, received 2 nervous calls in 3 days. On February 6, 1960, Belvin played the 2,600-seat Robinson Auditorium in Little Rock, Arkansas, with Jackie Wilson, Marv Johnson, Bobby Lewis, and a few other acts. It was the city's first show for a racially mixed audience, and white supremacists that shouted racial epithets managed to halt the show twice. After the show, Jesse and Joanne Belvin loaded up in the backseat of a black Cadillac. Another band member rode shotgun while driver Charles Shackelford, who had recently been fired by Ray Charles for swerving, steered the vehicle southwest. The ride ended 100 miles down Route 67 in a head-on collision near the town of Hope. A state trooper on the scene stated that the rear tires had obviously been tampered with. Belvin and Shackelford died shortly after the accident, while Joanne died later at the hospital. The third passenger survived but never gave any interviews about what really went down that night. So, aside from the fact that these artists are incredibly influential just in music, they influence their culture. They influence their generation to look at, I guess, take a stance on where they were and to see if they could break down doors. I think that's a big part of rock and roll. Jesse Belvin is obviously was a pioneer for the African Americans of that time. Another artist who I'm sure most everyone here loves, just like me, is Jimi Hendrix. And we tried, a lot of these musicians there have been great biographies already written, and we're not going to try and repeat everything that those people have already done a splendid job doing. But we did try to find some information that maybe wasn't as widely known. And this little bit I'm going to read is about Jimi Hendrix, which I don't know if too many people are aware that Jimmy was only in the spotlight for like 3 years, which is less of our college education. But, he changed music forever. So a few weeks after Brian's arrest, The Experience, talking about Brian Jones earlier, The Experience played 2 shows at the Seville Theater owned by Beatles manager Brian Epstein. It was June 4th, 1967, and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band had been released just 3 days earlier. The record blocked RU Experience from reaching number 1, but newcomer Hendrix knew how to one-up the Beatles. Jimmy showed up 30 minutes before the band was due on stage and announced to Noel and Mitch that they were opening with Sgt. Pepper. "We thought he had gone daft," Noel recalled to Charles Cross. They listened to the song on a portable record player while Jimmy played through the chord changes and quickly rearranged the horn section to make it work on the guitar. The Experience hit the stage in front of an audience that included Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Eric Clapton, Jack Bruce, and the rest of Britain's music cognoscenti. Opening with a Beatles cover 3 days after its release with members of the Beatles in the audience was an extremely cocky move, but the Experience pulled it off. Afterwards, the band headed to Epstein's après party, and Paul McCartney greeted Hendrix at the door with a huge joint and said, "That was fucking great, man." Paul's endorsement was the best thing that could have happened for Hendrix's career at that stage. The Beatles were on board. The Beatle was on the board for an upcoming festival in California, and he strongly recommended The Who and Jimmy's Experience. He even suggested that the virtually unknown expat should be one of the headliners. A few weeks later, Jimmy left England for a strange mix of premiere and homecoming. Only 9 months had passed since he was a penniless sideman on the Chitlin circuit, but the changes in Jimmy's life were more than most musicians could ever dream. He returned from Britain, leading a trio with a successful record, escorted by Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones. And another just very compelling part of this research for us was we kind of had ignored the idea of astrology and numerology of really playing a component to this, and thought that we should spend some time with it. And actually that's probably our favorite part of the book. The information that we found and the people that we spoke with enlightened us to a realm. For instance, in astrology, I think most Westerners now think of astrology as being your daily horoscope, but that's really not the history of astrology. That's what we're aware of. So I'm going to read a little bit about this discussion in astrology. And I think it gives some insight to perhaps like a lot of the changes that we go through at the age of 27, 28, 29. Because there are so many near misses at the age of 27. There's a lot of 26s. There's a lot of 28s. And, again, this is the age at which most famous musicians have passed away at. Turning 30 is a big deal. Many experience the last years of their 20s as a transitional phase between youth and maturity. 30 marks the real entry to adulthood, an age where most people have completed their university degrees, found their vocation, and are comfortably settled in a relationship or not. Renowned astrologer Rob Tillett, who spent the 70s as a touring rock and roller in his native Australia and now publishes the popular site Astrology on the Web, says that we spend the end of our 20s clearing the decks of karmic debris for a clean course for the next cycle. Every 29 years naturally presents us with a challenge to rise to new levels of awareness or face the consequences of having failed to gain the wisdom required to do so, Tillett says. It's a phenomenon known in astrology as Saturn return. It takes the planet Saturn 29 and a half years to return to the same position it occupied at the time we were born, a significant event as it marks the end of one cycle and the beginning of another. Astrologers argue that Saturn return is one of life's most important thresholds, as it intensifies one's feelings of sadness, isolation, and of purpose. I had marked a lot of other places, but I'm going to go ahead and jump towards the end and kind of close it out with giving a little bit more, I guess, discussion about all of the musicians as a whole. Transparent musicians offer a true glimpse of their psyche through their art. We can hear Jimmy's burn at the Isle of Wight. The fun is gone. His timing is off, and a Marshall stack screeches in dissonant feedback. Chris Bell's posthumous solo album is a touching projection of his depressed soul. Ditto for Pete Ham and Alan Wilson. Nietzsche called the burn a Dionysian reaction, and the 27s used it to compose, record, and perform music that added new veins to the organism of rock and roll. Some are thick arteries, while others are mere trickles. Brian Jones, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, Kurt Cobain. Strong associations appear from merely reading their names. Jimmy once said he wanted to lead a big band. In a profound way, he got what he asked for. He has written and conducted by example for pretty much every rock band since he took London by storm. The Big Five's instant impact hasn't been replicated by the rest of the 27s, but that's of little importance to the greater story. D. Boone and the Minutemen were important to fans in the American hardcore scene. The trio showed that it was possible to make songs and tour without industry sponsorship and stadium engagements. Their "our band could be your life" philosophy inspired an infant Red Hot Chili Peppers, REM's Michael Stipe, Sublime's Brad Nowell, and many more. Then there are 27s who, like vintage wine, get better with age. Artists are frequently misunderstood, and it can take time before their influence manifests. Take the Stooges, who expanded on the Stones' dirtiness. Compare "I Want to Be Your Dog" to "I Want to Be Your Man." At the tail end of the 60s, the unrefined garage sound was abandoned until the reactionary Stooges added crude chaos and uber-fuzzy guitars to the shambles of early rock. People literally laughed at the music and lack of musicianship, but were transfixed by Iggy's outrageous stage antics. The proto-punkers remained a freakish anomaly until the Ramones united in their love of the Stooges and popularized punk. And in a few decades, the Stooges went from being the wart of rock to having its 3 early records in Rolling Stone's top 500 albums of all time. Not too bad, huh? Similarly, power pop picked up where the Beatles left off, but Big Star and Badfinger were oddballs too. Saccharine harmonies and tight rock arrangements weren't nearly as cool as Misionic's stadium rock. Yet aware from the flattering spotlight, they produced a sound that paved the way for Cheap Trick, the Bangles, the Smithereens, Teenage Fan Club, the Posies, Matthew Sweet, and others. Bear in mind that influencing other musicians can take years or even decades, so it's difficult to determine how important Sean McCabe, Jeremy Ward, or Brian Otteson will be 5 or 10 years from now. It all depends on how they are remembered by fans and musicians. But if the Mars Volta's explosive popularity is any indication, Jeremy Ward might very well become increasingly revered. Rock's thickest artery is without doubt the blues, as it nourishes every other subgenre, and its music and or lyrical themes of love, suffering, and sudden fortune. Its undisputed leader, at least in the eyes of rockers, is Robert Johnson, another 27. Thank you very much. So I guess we're open the floor up to questions. So does anybody want to start us off? The guy with his first hand up.
One of the earlier readings, you talked about how every generation thinks that a younger generation is destroying the world. How does the rock and roll generation differ, if at all, from the jazz generation, the ragtime generation, the Mozart generation? Yeah, the question is, how does rock and roll, the rock and roll generation, differ from earlier generations in terms of the perception of an elder perspective or generation on, yeah, you're ruining everything, you're ending the world that we've created. And I guess my take on that is it doesn't. Rock and roll is the genre that created so much paranoia in older Americans, and the parents seeing their kids get involved with it. And rock and roll isn't even the latest genre to do that. We'd have to say rap is the genre, the latest of the most likely suspect to end this American world, this way of life that we've created. And of course, it's not going to end the world either. Rap hasn't ended the world. Punk didn't end the world. Rock and roll didn't end the world. Jazz didn't end the world. Mozart didn't end the world. In that sense of paranoia, it's a natural cycle, and one of the things that's interesting, because that observation comes out of our perspective on the Green Day chapter, and I think the smartest thing that Green Day does on American Idiot is actually signal an awareness of the perpetuation of that cycle, because the album begins with the sweet song Jesus of Suburbia, and that song fades out with the chorus of home, you're leaving, you're leaving, you're leaving, you're leaving. But the album ends with the suite titled Homecoming. And, Jesus of Suburbia, what's her name has gone off and married what's his face. Jesus of Suburbia is the kids have left him behind. He's suffering that worst fate that any person, any American teenager can suffer, and that is his friends have left him. They're out having fun, and they're having more fun without him. Everyone left you, nobody likes you, we're all out without you having fun. He's by himself. He's been abandoned by his scene. He's moved on. That song ends with the chorus, home, we're coming home. And there is that cycle perpetuating himself. He's ready, he's ready to step in to the same cycle that his parents' generation and his grandparents' generation and his great-grandparents' generation, youth rebellion, unfortunately, in the cycle that American Idiot creates, and that so many of others before it have presented. It's a pocket rebellion. It doesn't go anywhere. It cycles back in upon itself. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. Meet the new scene, same as the old scene. So it's a cynical and disappointing but inevitable conclusion to the anxiety of adolescent apocalypse. It doesn't go anywhere.
I was a little interested in the upside of that kind of sentiment that just quoted Pete Townsend, and that rock is dead, long live rock. And you get the same sort of ambiguity with like the really mournful Neil Young song at the same level, right? But even if there is like this tendency to assimilate, and I feel with Green Day, there's something about the mass market making records and getting rich off of that has to do with that. Of course, they didn't know that when they were writing Dookie, right? But what, even with the pessimism, how do you start to talk about the upsurge, especially when you're selling records within the market economy? I mean, I think about the ambiguous relation that Cobain had towards his hits, and he knew they were sort of hits. I think even as records were getting released, and even when he was writing them. But I just wanted to open it up to basically ask, how do you account for the upsurge, the not pessimistic, more optimistic vein that these guys seem to be opening up while they're closing it off, quite frankly? I mean, it seems like a really double-sided thing.
Well, I think one of the ironies that irony might not be the best word, but the question is how do you account for the upsurge? There is this pessimism, yet there is still this sense of moving forward, of renewing the energy of rock and roll. And I guess from the apocalyptic standpoint, in a common sensibility, apocalypse is seen as an ending. However, in its biblical sense and its deepest cultural sense, apocalypse is both an ending and a rebirth. So there is energy in that destruction. There is energy in that ending. The old world must die for the new world to be born, and that might be, that might just be the central engine of rock and roll and recreating itself.
Is it talking in terms of an engine? It may just be like solid guitar and backbeat that propels the thing forward, regardless of any content. I mean, once you write a song or establish an ethos, well, it gets assimilated quite quickly. You make T-shirts about it, but you're always going to be able to write a rocket song, right?
Exactly. I mean, Kmart can sell, Kmart can be selling flannel shirts for $3 the week before Nevermind hits, and suddenly they're $15. But there's always going to be a kid with a guitar and a new slant on that form. At least we pray. If I pray at all, it's for that. Give me that new kid with the new slant and the guitar.
So Josh, in writing about the 27s and having so many artists in the past having died at 27, 26, 28, do you think there's going to be any sort of concern of those artists who are coming up for 25, 26, who are going to go, this is the new 30?
Sounds like Britney.
There you go.
It's in the book.
The question is, do up-and-coming artists have some awareness of this concept of dying at 27? Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's, just in the last 6 or 8 months, both Britney Spears, who turns 28 December 2nd, I believe, something like that, and she's made comments that she's worried about joining the 27 Club. She's aware of it. Amy Winehouse has made multiple remarks about it.
Probably number one there.
Yeah, she's feared. And, Richie Edwards of the popular Manic Street Preachers, which is, in some ways, you could say a parallel to the U.S.'s Nirvana in the UK. Very, very influential band. He was really aware of Kurt Cobain, and he disappeared very soon afterwards and kind of seemed to, played into that whole concept and wanted to be a part of it. So I do think that it's out there on the horizon, and I think it's something that a lot of musicians are really aware of. I've heard multiple people saying, they're at concerts or even personally being at a concert and, someone's celebrating a birthday, and when you find out what year it is, if they're 28, there's like this collective, oh, wow, you made it through 27. So
My son's a 28-year-old musician. He's happy.
he's happy. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I definitely think it's a component for sure.
Just off of that a little bit, how many of the 27ers are women?
There's actually only three of them. And, we have talked with different people about that, and again, there's nothing we could actually just say as proof, but, it just seems like there's obviously a natural tendency for males to be very destructive a lot of times with how they are at that age. And, I think there's definitely a difference of maturity, and again, I don't know a lot about that, but I think we're all pretty aware of, how we all react, men versus women, in our late 20s.
How old are you?
32. 32, yeah.
I will tell you that I was a young man. I was younger than 27, but when that triumvirate of Hendrix, Joplin, and Morrison died, I had my friends that we were up to no good, but it's like we went, they were all 27. And we kind of noticed that. We didn't know about Robert Johnson. We didn't know about any of the rest, but it's like, it was kind of really interesting even in 1971, 72.
I'm sure that because that's the thing, a lot of this, sparks tons of conspiracies, and that's one thing we really did try to avoid, because, you've got people that the government killed all three of them, And I mean, there was a lot going on. I realize why, people might be thinking that way, but that it's completely, it's bizarre. It's really bizarre. Absolutely.
We're also going to, these guys will sign the books, and we've got plenty of books, and we'll get all that taken care of. But if there are more questions, more antidotes, more,
Well, thanks, Warren, Frank. Absolutely, man.
Thank you so
Definitely.
much. And thank you, everyone, for
Thank you
coming
for
out.
coming out. Appreciate it.